introduction of the governor this evening will be made by Ambassador J. Fife Symington. Ambassador Symington was the president pro tem of this council in 1980, its founding year, has made major contributions to the council, and is again, 20 years later, this is our 20th season, again on our board of trustees. Ambassador Symington.
Governor Glendening, ladies and gentlemen, it's a distinct honor to have the privilege of introducing our governor to you. He needs no introduction, I'm sure. I'm going to make my few remarks very, very quickly because I know you're very much interested in what the governor's going to tell us. And I do want to say that after nearly 20 years, this organization has just jumped from an anthill to a small mountain. When we founded this thing way back in about 18 years ago, a remarkable fellow with whom I was associated, and I was in his shadow all the time, was Jim Rouse. And Jim and Frank Burd and I got together, and at that point, once we started the council on its road, if we had 20 people at a meeting, we thought that was absolutely fantastic. And the proof of the pudding and what has been done, hopefully for this community of Maryland and Baltimore, is the number that I look around and see here tonight. It's with the greatest pleasure that I introduce you, Governor Glendening, after many years. It's wonderful.
Mr. Ambassador, it's so nice to see you again, and thank you not just for your introduction, but far more importantly, thank you for your leadership all these years, both this organization and for the country, and we appreciate it so very much. As I say, it's a real pleasure to be here, and Frank, I thank you for the kind invitation, in fact, the repeated invitation, and they started about a year ago, but we were involved in some political activities and all that sort of stuff, and but I said right after the election I will be here, and so I'm so very, very pleased to be here. It gives a nice opportunity really to talk a little bit and give my perspective on the future of business and economic development, but perhaps even as interestingly, some new roles that are developing for states across this country relative to the international arena. I also, by the way, welcome this opportunity because whenever you get an invitation for a friendly audience, as governor, you immediately seize that invitation. And the reason I word it that way, you see, in many cases, you can be almost guaranteed that it's not going to be a friendly audience, and introductions and all will not be friendly. In fact, let me just tell you a story that puts being governor at the end of the 20th century in perspective. I was introduced not too long ago, and a person told a story about general reputation of governors, and he said that some people had died and they were standing in line waiting to go into heaven, and St. Peter was there and making room assignments and all, and as they started talking to one another during the wait, the one gentleman said to the other, "What did you do down on earth?" And the first gentleman said, well, he had been Pope. And they talked a while what it was like to be Pope and so on, and then the Pope said, "What did you do?" And he said, well, he had been governor. And so they talked a while about that. And they get inside, and St. Peter made the assignments, and the Pope finds himself in a small cinder block, very austere apartment, a cot and one candle. And he looks around and he says, well, this isn't what I expected, but what the heck? That's the way popes talk. But he said, what the heck, at least I'm pleased to be here in heaven. And he said, let me go see how my friend, the governor, is doing. And he goes across the way and he finds the governor in this big mansion up on the hill, and works of art and crystal chandeliers and little nymphs floating around. I didn't even know what that meant. I had to ask Meb over here. But it was just wonderful. And so the next day he sees St. Peter and he says, I'm not complaining or anything. He said, but let me ask you a question. He said, how do you make these room assignments? Because after all, I spent my whole life down on earth being Pope, doing good things. And he said, and I got this austere little apartment. And my friend, the governor, gets this mansion up in the hill. And St. Peter looks at him and says, well, you got to understand it this way. We've got a lot of popes up here, but this was the first governor that ever made it. And therein is a general reputation and so on. They said, this be a real friendly audience. I said, all right, I'll do it. Seriously, I am very, very pleased and more than pleased. I'm honored to be here to address the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. As Fife mentioned, for almost 20 years now, you have allowed high-ranking U.S. and foreign officials to provide their unique insights in terms of what is going on in the world and to the various dynamics. And by the way, I would ask, as I was looking over my notes and realized 1980, I think, it formed, and what this has meant, just think of the changes, the exciting changes that have taken place in this world in the last 20 years on the economy, on the political front, on the military front, and on the geography of the world. And to think that you were here and had these insights and the opportunity to discuss these issues all is just phenomenal. And so I want to commend you for that role and hope that it continues well into the next century. And I tell you, I'm pleased to be here to offer my more limited perspective. It is an interesting times in terms of state governments. More than ever before, individual state governments now have the ability to establish all types of relationships with nations and with businesses overseas. And it is often not just about business development, a point that I'll make later. And it's also often generally a very personal governor to president, governor to governor, to mayor, whatever it might be, type opportunity. I will tell you, Maryland is in a position, I think, to be very aggressive and take advantage of our unique opportunities and to help not only promote the economy of Maryland, but to help in many, many other ways. When I talk about the economy of Maryland, to put it in perspective, what we should remember is that with a lot of people working together, and indeed many of you in this room, our economy is just absolutely booming. Think about the fact that in the last 4 years we have a net increase of well over 100,000 new jobs. That you may recall about 4 years ago, one of the debates in the campaign 5 years ago now was that we were 49th in the country in terms of creation of new jobs. The U.S. Census Bureau now lists us as 13th in the country just 4 years later in creation of new jobs. And in fact, the type of jobs that are being created here are so strong and so much part of the economy of the future that we've now moved up to the third largest family income in the nation, which is very significant, and our unemployment rate is literally at an all-time low. Since the beginning of the keeping of these type of records, it has never been as low as it is now. And also, you probably saw this report just recently, we have one of the lowest poverty rates in the entire country, and I'm very pleased that our welfare rolls in the last 3 years have declined by 66%. What that means as a practical matter is that 148,000 people who were on welfare 4 years ago have now moved productively into the economy or into learning and away from the dependency and into self-sufficiency. And as a reflection of all that, we now have well over $1 billion in surplus and reserves, and in fact, it looks like in addition to our reserves, about $600 million, we're going to end up with close to $1 billion additional surplus. Those are phenomenal figures. And I say this because we're going into the national and the world market from a very, very strong position. However, I also remind everyone, now is not the time to be complacent. We cannot let our guard down, even for just a moment. This is a very competitive world. It's a very competitive world, not just between what might be going on with Maryland and Northern Virginia or Delaware, or not even among other states. It is literally a competitive world for investment and for jobs any place in the world. And what we have found very, very clearly is that companies can invest and they can locate, and jobs and prosperity can occur just as easy here or in Ireland or in Buenos Aires. I see our Secretary of Transportation over here, John Picari, who's doing a wonderful job. In fact, we just came back from a trip to Argentina, and it was very interesting to see the very type of companies that we're talking about here as well, making these type of location decisions. In order to try to continue to be competitive, working with the legislature, we've undertaken a number of additional things to sharpen our competitive edge. I am very pleased that we were able to reduce or eliminate 20 different taxes, including the first reduction of the income tax in over 30 years when we made a 10% reduction there. Those tax reductions returned about $2.2 billion to the economy. I would also note the only tax that we've increased in the last 5 years, or likely to increase for the entire administration, is the cigarette tax, and that was done primarily as a health issue in terms of the protection of the children. In addition to those tax reductions, we made a major effort in streamlining the permitting process and the regulatory reform, as well as incentive grants that we can, and tax credits that we can use in terms of retention and attraction of businesses. I believe, however, in all of these economic development tools notwithstanding, that the single most important thing that we are doing and that we must do in terms of our competition within the country and within the world is the focus on education. There's the education group right there, right? But seriously, what we have got to recognize is that the economy, not that's emerging in the future, but the economy that's right before us now and growing is a knowledge-based economy. And investments and prosperity is going to go where the workforce is best trained and best educated, and where you have the concentration of advanced degrees and specialized training that is absolutely necessary. And that is the reason that we've made the education the focus of this administration. When I talk about the changes in the economy, and most of you know this, and you could give as many examples, but I'm always reminded of something that happened shortly after I came into office. I had, like many people, worked my way through college. I had a variety of jobs, but one of the jobs that I had was in a machine shop. And my job was to stand in the back of a horizontal lathe, or a screw machine as we called it, and I would pick up steel or copper or whatever and put it into the machine. And up in the front of the machine, there was a machinist who would run the die head. And between the two of us, we would make nuts and bolts and screws and all of that sort of stuff. And it was hard work, it was hot and it was oily, but it was also good paying and helped me get through college. And shortly after becoming governor, a friend of mine called from a company down in Salisbury, a company called Motec. And Raphael, who owns that company, said he's having a real problem. He's got outstanding orders, he's got expansion, but he cannot find employees. And so I said to him, I said, Raphael, I said, I don't understand this. I said, you're located in Salisbury, and unfortunately that was at that time one of the areas with a larger unemployment rate. How can you not find employees for a machine shop? And so I said, I'm coming down to visit you. And I went down to his shop, and in fact, if you're heading to Ocean City, just before you hit Salisbury and you look to your left, you'll see his company there. And as I went in, the machines, interestingly, were very similar to, in shape and the horizontal lathes, to what we had 30 years ago when I was in college, except in the back of the machine where my job was, and where I used to just, you know, this is the way I did. I'd pick up the steel and I'd go, oomph, and I'd shove it in there, and I was done, right? They now have a robotic-controlled operation that carefully puts it in and gets every centimeter of material, and the productivity has gone way up, except it's robotic-controlled now. And up in the front of the machine, where the machinist was, the die head is now a computer-controlled die head system. And sitting off on the side in front of a console, running 3 machines, and therefore 6 jobs, was one person that they were now calling a machinist. And that's what they were looking for. Now, it is very, very clear. What is needed is the technological training of our workforce in order to be competitive. Interestingly, as I went and visited them, I was really struck by the fact that they are located right next to, and in fact, one of their lead customers is Filtronic PLC. Filtronic, which is part of the Philips European Corporation, in fact, makes electronic communications equipment, and they started in 1993 with 3 employees. Today, they have over 200 employees there, and they are now actually recruiting software engineers from the republics of the former Soviet Union by way of New York and bringing them here because they cannot find the number of trained personnel. And their equipment, which is made by Martech, is in danger of, if you will, not being able to meet all the orders because of this expansion. And so what we're looking at here is very, very clear. If we don't invest into workforce training, and we don't invest in education, and we don't invest in higher education, we're not going to be competitive. In fact, I heard the support here from Northrop Grumman. It was interesting when I was talking with Jim Roach and Northrop Grumman. He was telling us that they have over 200 vacancies in software engineer positions that they are trying to fill. That, by the way, is more than is produced annually by the universities of the state of Maryland. And so you can see the challenge that is before us. I would also note, I remembered a conversation. I was over in Norway working with the Minister of Defense in terms of support of one of the Northrop Grumman systems that they were working with the Defense Department there. And I was thinking, on the one hand, here we are trying to help on the assistance of the sale, and on the other hand, here we are back home saying if we're going to stay competitive, we've got to invest in education. And so we were all working on this together. That is why, by the way, in terms of our competitiveness, part of our overall philosophy, both domestically and internationally, is to make sure we have the best trained, best educated, best degreed workforce in the entire world. In order to do that, we've done things such as create the advanced technology centers, which provide the retraining and the training at the company's specifications of what is needed. That's why we put one of those advanced technology centers at Salisbury State University, and that's why Martech now is directly training its workers through the university, as is Filtronic. That's why we also launched our science and engineering computer scholarship program, in which we say to young people, to our best and brightest, we now say to our A and B students in high school, go into science, engineering, computers or technology, do well, we'll pay your tuition in college, and the only thing we ask is that you stay in Maryland the number of years that you go to college. If you do that, then it's a total grant. If you did something silly like go to New Jersey, then it becomes a low-interest loan. But in either case, what we're trying to do is to broaden significantly the number of people in these areas. We're also in the process, and have done it for the last several years, but we'll have even more dramatic announcements as a result of our large surplus of historic investments in education overall, and particularly in higher education, to make sure that we maintain this competitive edge. Along with the education, another key component in terms of our competitive efforts has been to strengthen Maryland economy, has been our international outreach. We drafted, the first year that I was in office, for the first time, a strategic plan aimed at increasing Maryland's participation in the world market. Interestingly, up until that time, we did not have a fully laid out strategic plan, and we tended to respond to different initiatives or requests on an ad hoc basis. Our idea is to increase significantly or raise significantly the profile of Maryland to attract investment from foreign-owned firms, to enter into partnerships, as well as to sell our products overseas. And we have been successful. In 1998, for example, Maryland exports totaled $5.3 billion. And as the world market continues to improve, we expect that figure to continue to grow significantly. To give you an idea, to put it in perspective of what that means, in 1986, it was only $1.7 billion. And so in the last 12 years, we've had a 212% increase in exports. I would note, by the way, in the last 6 months, there has been a decline in those exports. We're our best of our ability to tell. Part of it is that the domestic market has expanded so much, as well as, of course, some of the residual effects in terms of the Asian markets and some other problems there. But there's an interesting thing, and at some point we've got to try to work with the federal government and address that, and that is the statistics that are used in terms of import and export really don't capture services in terms of engineering and financial and managerial, the knowledge-based services. And that is one of the strengths of the export that this state has as well. And so that figure of $5.3 billion, I believe to be a relatively small reflection of what is actually going on. We've also seen a significant growth in foreign investment in Maryland. We now have over 800 foreign-owned firms with facilities operating here in Maryland. Those firms, by the way, employ about 105,000 Marylanders. And I'm also pleased that they continue to grow very steadily. In fact, employment at those firms are growing about 5% a year, making foreign investment a powerful force in our economy. Just as I mentioned, you think about the growth of Filtronic from 3 to 200 employees, and these are good-paying, high-tech jobs in just 6 years. That's an example of what's happening. Our key areas of outreach and part of our strategic plan and part of our success are in the areas of biotechnology, information technology, finance, and transportation. If I might comment just very briefly on those 4 areas, we have assets in this state such as the Johns Hopkins University, the University of Maryland, National Institutes of Health, and a variety of others that have helped make Maryland the 3rd largest center of biotechnology in the entire country. And we have over 300 companies now in that area with over 45,000 technical and professional workers. And they continue to expand dramatically. Just as an example, Intelligene, a company located in Jerusalem, a biotech company, and it specializes in the development of rapid diagnostic test kits, just recently opened a new research facility and development facility at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County Technology Center. And when we were 2 years ago in Israel working with the high-tech firms and the biotech firms, it is clear that they have targeted Maryland as a major place for partnerships and for investment. I would also note that the Baltimore-Washington corridor boasts the 2nd largest concentration of information technology firms in the entire United States, and with real strengths in satellite communications and aerospace and software development as well as the internet. It was interesting. On the way back from Buenos Aires, sounds like an odd way to go back, I guess, but we stopped in Seattle, and my wife was excited about that, as you all are. But we stopped in Seattle and met with the Microsoft people for 2 days. And their interpretation of what is going on in the world market and also what is happening both in Maryland and in the Mid-Atlantic region was very, very fascinating, extraordinarily positive in terms of what's happening here in the future. As a result of these strengths, though, what we're finding is companies from around the world that are interested in tapping in a big way to that part of the economy are locating both research facilities as well as manufacturing facilities here in Maryland. For example, the 3SL company from the United Kingdom, which is a software development company, just opened a new office in Montgomery County, and that is one of a whole string of similar type information science firms that are locating here. We also have recent expansions in things such as the Dutch-owned Aegon Company, the Swiss-owned Zurich Insurance, the Irish-owned Allfirst, the BT, Alex Brown, Deutsche Bank, all enhancing significantly our reputation as a financial center as well. And the other part where we seem to be having a great deal of strength is in the distribution area. The Baltimore-Washington corridor is the 4th largest consumer market in the entire country, and we're just 3 hours away from the largest market in the U.S., and that is the greater New York market. We have a tremendous transportation system, including the Port of Baltimore, BWI Airport, and the 2 Class 1 railroads and so on, and this has made us increasingly successful in our competition there. Over the last 6 years, we've invested a little over $1 billion, and we have significant additional investments in the port and in the BWI airport. I must tell you, if we're going to continue to be competitive in this area, we must make sure that we continue to make some tough decisions and we continue to invest in these facilities. Just as an example, with regard to the dredging plans for the port, and you've seen some discussions of this as well, I must tell you, I understand clearly the necessity of protecting the Chesapeake Bay. With modesty, we have achieved a reputation, I think, as being one of the most aggressive states in the entire country in terms of protecting the environment. But at the same time, what we must do while we protect the bay is to make sure that there is dredging at the port and at the channels to make sure that we are competitive on a world basis, because that portion of the market could slip away very, very rapidly. I will tell you, as an example of what we're talking about, 2 years ago, we were in Taiwan and met with the chairman of Evergreen Shipping, Chairman Chang, and I was just absolutely amazed at the detail of the knowledge that he had about the Baltimore port. And John will recall this meeting, but we're sitting at the table, and he started asking specifically, he said, well, let me ask you, at this turn, isn't it true that the channel goes down to 42 feet? And you've got your approval for this, but is it true that it's going to take 6 years before you can bring it to 50 feet? And he had every detail of our port and the channels down. And by the way, he wasn't looking at detailed notes or anything. He knew what was at stake here. And I say this because if we do not make the tough decisions and find a way to make sure that we do the dredging and remain competitive, the port will lose its competitive edge. I would note that meeting with Chairman Chang was just one of the many times I've had to meet with international business leaders, and in each case it's clear to me that their knowledge of our economy and of our assets is very, very pointed, including of our workforce and including where we're going. I remember meeting with a Dutch company that was going to expand in western Maryland and in Cumberland. They subsequently did so, but they knew the employment rates for all 3 western Maryland counties and had them down without glancing at a note or anything, and knew, if you will, what was available in terms of the workforce. I dare say very few of us could look at a neighboring country and say, well, we understand these regions or provinces or states that this is the employment rate. I also think it's extremely important that we recognize the personal involvement that is necessary if we're going to continue to be successful and if we're going to continue to be competitive. Personal involvement of the governor, lieutenant governor, personal involvement of our Secretary of Economic Development, Mike Lewin, who's doing a tremendous job, of our Secretary of Transportation, and of others. Just as in business, there's nothing like having the principal right there ready to negotiate. I say this in part because there's always an interesting phenomenon in the media, and I know we have some media here, so they'll immediately write something negative that I said this, but whenever you go abroad, there's this expectation that you're going to return and you're going to hold up some huge contract and everything is solved forever. In fact, international trade does not work that way. It's about relations. It's about working long-term. And we have had, out of visits that we had several years ago, very positive, measurable results. And what we've got to do is to keep that focus on the personal involvement. I recall our several meetings, for example, in Great Britain with officials from British Air, and about 18 months later, they expanded the number of flights after we reached some joint marketing agreements and things of that type. In Brazil, just 2 weeks ago, I met with Aerocruise as well as Star Shipping. We sat down, we had a long working lunch, and among other things, we talked about their expansion. Aerocruise is a wood pulp company, the largest shipper of wood pulp into the port of Baltimore, the pulp that is used for production of paper. Star Shipping Lines is one of the major shipping lines that handles all of the pulp imports. They laid out for us what they thought their expansion needs were likely to be. They asked us to consider carefully additional investments in terms of the warehouse space, the storage space, and things of this type. And while we still have several months of discussions to go on, we're very confident that we're going to be successful in this area as well. We're continuing to market the state aggressively around the globe, and in fact, Peter O'Neill, where's Peter so I can introduce him? Peter O'Neill over here is the manager of our international business portion for Port, doing a tremendous job, and we're being very, very aggressive. But, you know, it's also an interesting aside, and that is as exciting as our success in the global economy has been, and as bright as our prospects are for the future, we also must recognize that the new millennium is bringing the states into an interesting, different position, and it's more than just about jobs and contracts and economic exchange. Some of you have heard the reference to the 1990s as being the decade of the states, and even more so, I think, as if I could put on my academic hat of 27 years, but even more so as we go into the next century, you're going to see broader and broader state international contact, state international relations. And more than ever before, the states are having an opportunity to take the lead on key issues. It's interesting whether you talk about things such as welfare reform or education reform or environmental programs. Some states are recognized as being the natural leaders in those areas. One of the things, just as an illustration, I'm really pleased that Maryland has become a national leader in showing how good environmental policy can be consistent with a very successful economic development policy, that our smart growth anti-sprawl efforts have become a national model with a number of states literally adopting similar policies as we try to deal with the issues of sprawl. Not surprisingly, when a state is leading in a particular area, we're getting a lot of international requests as well in terms of exchange. For example, when I was in Brazil, we were asked by a group of business leaders and environmental leaders to meet with them and to have a discussion on Guanabara Bay. Guanabara Bay, which is about half the size of the Chesapeake Bay, sadly is a very, very polluted body of water with as much as 700,000 dwellings having their effluent flow directly into the bay with no treatment whatsoever. And it was interesting. They initially talked about a breakfast in which there might be 50 people. It turned out that there was standing room only, well over 125 people, and they all had one fundamental question. How has Maryland taken the lead, not only in the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay, but environmental programs, and at the same time have a strong economy? Because for many nations of the world, the issue is still a trade-off between what do you do in the environment versus what it costs on economic development. And they were really, really interested in what we were doing here. And then subsequently, later that afternoon, when I met with the governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro and his cabinet, one of the first questions that came up was the same type of thing as we signed a renewed sister state agreement, was would we be willing to expand those interactions to include exchanges and information and assistance on environmental programs. And I'm pleased that the new agreement does exactly that. Also talking about a broader role, while we were in Brazil, I was pleased to be invited to appear before the Center of American Studies in Rio de Janeiro, and their issue was about federalism and the emerging role of the states. And Brazil is one of the countries, and so many are struggling with this around the world, from the former Soviet Union republics to Brazil to Canada, where we'll be next weekend, on the nature of a federal system. And how can you have good, strong local state decision-making and local economies and everything else and still have a national entity. And what they wanted to know again was what is going on in the American political and economic system that is leading to the strengths of the states, which indirectly is contributing so significantly to the economy, and whether or not there's some models for them to follow on there as well. On a similar mission to Europe earlier this year, we met with a large audience of shipping line and air carriers and started talking about strengthening the relationship with Maryland. But when I spoke to the American Club in Copenhagen, it was not only to promote specific business partnerships, but also most of the questions and most of the discussion was about the future direction of the U.S. economy overall, and specifically they wanted to know about who was doing what in education and how we were able to accumulate additional capital, both at the state level, at the national level, to get into a surplus position, as well as what was happening in the private sector. It's a few examples of what is, I guess, becoming increasingly common, and that is states involved in international issues that go beyond the traditional economic development or sister city people type exchange. I remember when I was in Stockholm, there was a huge meeting about protection of estuaries around the world, and again they were looking at what we had here. We just hosted a delegation from Panama that was interested in how to protect the environment in the Bay of Panama as that country gets ready to take over the Panama Canal. And just this morning, we had a large delegations of members of the British House of Commons who came here to look at our tobacco policy, the lawsuits. If you have tobacco stocks, you may want to pay attention to that part because they're obviously considering something similar, and what we were doing with our tobacco settlement money and how it is that we made the decision to put the tobacco settlement money all into fighting cancer and preventing smoking, and whether the national government, central government, or local decisions should be made and so on. So it was very interesting having these type of discussions. Let me conclude with the observation. These are exciting times for state governments. It's a wonderful, exciting time to be governor. Best job in the world. Would urge everyone to do it at least once in their lifetime. Although Kathleen Kennedy Townsend asked me to, whenever I say that, to say after 11 years from now, please consider it. But I am really excited about what not only is going on in the economy and education, but Maryland's emergent role both domestically and internationally, about both the economic and the non-economic issues. And as we enter the 21st century, I'm extraordinarily pleased because I think our very best years are yet ahead of us, both domestically and internationally. And I'm honored to be here and talk a little bit about these things tonight. Thank you so very much.
Well, we thank you for a very comprehensive and I think very interesting overview. The governor will call upon you and repeat the questions for the camera.
The question was about the land around the port. These are underdeveloped, underutilized, or priorly utilized land. Some cases it's brownfields, prior industrial use, and in many cases it's just land that is not utilized at the moment. And the question was, what are we going to do about that land? We established through the legislature just 2 years ago now a port council. The port council identified, if I recall correctly, about 3,700 acres of land that is either totally unutilized or significantly underutilized. Let me add as a quick aside, when I talk about smart growth, that's part of what it's all about. Think of what you can do in growth and economic development in 3,700 acres of land without needing to go way out there somewhere and cut down one more acre of forest or to tear up one more farm. We have put together a marketing component that is going to be trying to literally to market that land into productive activity. There are a couple of challenges that we found, one of the biggest of which is much of the land is suspected of being prior brownfields with potential industrial pollution. We are doing the surveys and working something with the private sector and public sector on those surveys and through our brownfields legislation trying to make sure that we can bring them up to a healthy quality and then to certify so that the future liability will not be there. The brownfields program, however, is not working as well as we want, and we think we're probably going to have to do some additional economic incentives. The last part of your question was about the small business on that, and I think if we're going to be successful there, we've got to come up with some additional tools that permit small businesses to acquire some portion of that land, either by sale or by lease use, to be able to develop as well. And we would welcome your suggestions on how to do that. And I would urge that you chat also with John Picari, our Secretary of Transportation, right in front here. The question was, there were some kind words at the beginning. And I've long since learned that whenever someone starts out, I applaud you for this, there's going to be a but. And the kind words were on our efforts to stop the gun violence and to prevent casinos and slot machines from coming into the state, but then said with $1 billion surplus, will there be further tax cuts? We are working with the legislative leaders and trying to eliminate one tax that I do think is unfair, and that is the inheritance tax. We're one of relatively few states that have a significant state inheritance tax. We're going through the legislative leaders as well as the budget office, but I think we'll be able to work together and either phase that down or just outright eliminate it in 1 to 2 years maximum, with the legislation adopted this January. With regard to the other portion of the surplus, we are proposing, instead of reducing further, because we just reduced the income tax 10%, that we take that money and pay cash for very significant investment, primarily in school construction to reduce class size around the state, and in campus construction. For a couple of decades now, our campus buildings, as our presidents of the universities here can tell us, have been neglected. And we need significant, not only renovation and technology on our campuses, but additional spaces. As well as some additional investment in transportation needs. For example, we must rebuild the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. The state portion of that, when the federal government finally gets around to its fair share, will be about $200 million from Maryland and $200 million from the state of Virginia. We have proposed informally, and we'll probably have in the budget to our legislative leaders, that the state go ahead and put up its $200 million and put cash up so that we save the interest on the bonds. The same thing with the school construction. To put that in perspective just for a moment, last year when we put up $253 million for school construction to reduce class size and to modernize the older schools around the state, $165 million of that was cash instead of bonds. By paying cash, we saved $65 million in interest payments over the course of the next 15 years. That $65 million is the equivalent of 10 free elementary schools. And my feeling is that we would do better to go ahead and build the needed facilities on our campuses and the schools in our communities, go ahead and pay cash up front, and meet this while we have this surplus, and particularly because we're not increasing taxes, and indeed we've lowered or eliminated 20 taxes. And so we'll propose that to the legislature. There'll be a good, healthy debate, but with modesty in the end, I think will prevail. most people are probably aware there's this great debate going on. I do not support and, in fact, oppose any effort to tax in any way the ENET process, the whole internet process, the emerging industries in this area, or anything of that type. We do, however, have an interesting challenge before us, and this is what we're trying to work out, and that is increasingly people are buying things, goods and products and even services by way of the internet, the e-commerce. And in fact, today, that equals about $60 billion purchases. I know because I'm currently serving as vice chair of the National Governors Association. My chair, which I'll be next year, my chair is Governor Levitt of the state of Utah. And he has taken this issue on in a big way and trying to figure out what we should be doing. The key is that goods and services purchased by e-commerce is not taxable even at existing sales tax rate. And at one level, everyone say, well, gee, that's good. That's very nice. There are two things that happens. One is that existing businesses find themselves at a competitive disadvantage. But the other thing, and this is something we're going to have to somehow or other figure out what to do, and I must confess I don't know the answer, is that amount of commerce is increasing so rapidly that very shortly state and local governments will lose one of their major source of revenues, and that is the sales tax revenues. And then the question becomes, how do you fund your schools and your other needed programs? There are different ways of doing it, obviously. First of all, I believe there's no such thing as a free lunch, and so at some point we're going to have to come to grip with this. One way that is being suggested is a nationwide system that would simply go ahead and tax at the current level. Now the goods, not the process, not the internet or anything of this type. So if you buy a product from Maryland that has a 5% sales tax, you pay a 5% sales tax. But immediately the question is that for the place of purchase or is that by the purchaser? But there are other issues here. If you lose most of your sales tax base, what do you end up doing? Well, you could just cut services significantly because you're talking about a fourth of Maryland's revenues. Or you could seek an alternate taxing source altogether, and some people have said perhaps you should be taxing income and not consumption. There's a national commission that's trying to grapple with this issue. I don't think it's crisis proportion yet, but if the e-commerce continues to multiply at the geometric rate that it has been, there will be, for many, many states, a significant challenge of a loss of the bulk of a fourth of our revenues. For some states that do not have an income tax, it could be even more dramatic with 50 to 60% of the revenue. The governors are supporting the National Commission, in which is a 3-year moratorium that says no effort at state taxes on this, no effort at national taxes. Let's try to study it. Let's try to work with the industries, including those firms that use e-commerce, and see whether we can come up with a equitable solution that has a net of no increased tax and no tax on the process or the internet itself, but simply preserves existing revenues. And that's what we're trying to square through. The question was in terms of comments and problems with the education, particularly about teachers' and ability to attract people into teaching, keep them in teaching, and whether or not we need scholarships and other incentives along this line. We did establish just a year ago a major program similar to the technology scholarship for individuals going into teaching and who will commit to teach in Maryland. I'm pleased to say, because just yesterday I had the budget work session on the education portion of the budget. Interestingly, we did not use all the money that we had allocated for science and technology. We overused the money for people going into education, which was a very good sign. Bottom line, I think, is a crisis both in this state and across the country, and other states are addressing it, and governors have had full day work sessions on this. How do we get our best and brightest to go into teaching and to stay into teaching? And if we do not turn around some of the current trends, we're going to have a serious issue. Just as an example, We need over the next 2 years about 18,000 new teachers in the state of Maryland. Our state colleges and universities will produce only about 8,000, half of which will go out of state. And so you can see what is happening here. We're looking at from a variety of approaches. One, we've got to be candid about this, is salary. You've got to have a reasonable professional salary to support a family. And I will tell you what I will tell you what happens, and we don't have to be a mathematical genius to figure this out. You take a young shiny bright over to University of Maryland College Park, and they're in their computer science program, one of the best in the country, and they're sitting there and they say, if I went into teaching, I could start at about $23,000, and teachers always tell us that number of systems are less than that, but I could, on the average in Maryland, start at $23,000, and if I did really well, and eventually even went on and got my master's degree, in about 8 years' time, I could move up to about $40,000, and that's the state averages. If that same person goes out of that program into the private sector, they will probably start in the $50,000 range. They will easily move up to the $90,000, and if they have any entrepreneurial skills, they will become like young Kim, who just sold his company for almost $2 billion after 8 years of hard work. And I say it that way because we've got to recognize as a society what we're doing. The other part is, though, it's about the professionalism of the discipline. We need to invest more in professional development, true, meaningful professional development, and our personal responsibilities, I think, have to be far more tuned to giving teachers the respect and position in society that they deserve. We will never compete with those private sector salaries. We just can't do so. But we can say you are something special and unique in our society, and this is where we should be. I think everyone heard Mel's question without the repeating of it, but just to make sure over in this corner about the prepaid college tuition program. Real quickly, it's just a program where people can say, I'll invest $120 a month, whatever it is, or as a proud grandparent, I'll put in an annuity one-time payment, and I'll make sure that our young people can go to college. A number of states have this. The legislation that we submitted creating this 3 years ago had a state guarantee in it. The legislature at that time deleted those provisions. There are a number of average working families that really like this approach. It's disciplined savings for college future, but are concerned about the lack of the guarantee. We have talked with legislative leaders. There will be legislation introduced to restore that guarantee. It's got to go through the entire legislative process, but it appears to us that the fiscal leaders understand the need to do this, and that most other states that have successful prepaid college tuition programs do have a state guarantee behind that. I would predict that's going to pass this session. The question was that increasingly technology and high-tech technology is becoming such an important part of our life, and is there any thought about the state creating either high-tech council or other agencies that might help both general citizens as well as the business in this area? The answer is yes, and in fact we have done a number of these in the last couple of years. And I say a number of these because they're different areas. Some of them are literally a high-tech council, which is about coordinating technology policy. We have an internal that is in a state technology infrastructure group that is doing the wide-band fiber optic, literally connecting the entire state so that the same access would be available in Cumberland as it is here on the I-95 corridor. We also have established 3 different, because of their specialized focus, economic development tools that help generate capital for startup companies in the high-tech area, as well as to coordinate our economic development policy and our retraining policy for our employees to meet the needs of the high-tech area. Let me add one additional comment. It's a concern that I have about this, and that is I am very much afraid that we may be in a period in which there's a reference almost like the digital divide. and that is that some individuals and some communities will have access to information, will have access to technology and the net and everything else, and will do fine and will be very competitive, and they'll have the knowledge as well as the physical infrastructure. That there are others who, for a variety of reasons, may not. General Colin Powell, in a work session with the governors in August in St. Louis, referred to his concern about a digital apartheid that might be emerging in our society, not just based on race, but based simply on whether or not one has the education and the technological training and the access to technology. And that if you do not, a number of years ago, as we all know in our society, we had sad times, wrong times, when there were signs up that would say no blacks, no Irish, no Jews, whatever it might be. Fortunately, those signs are gone. But today, on help wanted ads and on investment opportunities and all, it is just as clear. If you do not have that training and that education and the access to computers and technology, it's just as if you had a sign up that was there 40 years ago. And I think what our collective mission has got to be is to make sure that no one is left behind in terms of this information and technology-based, knowledge-based economy that's emerged before our eyes, because it'll be, again, just as if we said to them, no women need apply. And that's the big danger, I think, facing as we go into this wonderfully exciting time. Thank you all so very much. Thank you.
Well, Governor, we certainly thank you for what's been a most enjoyable evening. I thought for a moment the protesters out in front were brought by the governor. They weren't. It's Seattle-based, and it has to do with the World Trade Organization, but it brought forth a wonderful stream of nostalgia for a lot of us to have the protesters at our council meetings once more. It's been a decade without them. We thank you for a memorable joke, Governor. And certainly, I think it's been a wonderfully comprehensive treatment of the subject, and it's been most generous of you to share so much of your time with us. Thank you very, very much.